So, first of all, welcome to Lecture 1, Chapter 1. And, Chapter 1 really just basically asks a simple question. Like, why do we study international relations? Like, what's the big deal, right? Uh, why is it, or is it important to be able to understand what goes on in other countries and how they do what they do, or why they do what they do? Does it really matter to us here in the United States? Uh, First of all, it's important to understand the foundation of understanding international relations is the way, in the context of how we explore it academically, is the notion of U.S. foreign policy. Uh, and the way that works is that for every single country on the planet, we have uh, information. Say if you had a volume of information or a book for every single country on the planet. Uh, there are over 200 of them in various forms. Not all necessarily countries, but there are also other variations as well. But nonetheless, there are over 200 of them. Some of them we have big volumes like China and Russia. There might be multiple volumes, and then for smaller countries like Cyprus or other smaller, the Maldives or other places, there might be little tiny volumes. But they all basically provide information about those countries and about what they do. Now, you might ask the question, what's important about that? Well, it's important because we have to recognize, first of all, that the various aspects of those countries, how are we going to deal with them? What is our relationship going to be to the rest of the world and to those respective countries, right? So, understanding that since the age of the internet, and the world has become closer and closer than it ever has been in human history, uh, the ability for other countries to relate and provide information and feedback instantaneously has never been such as it is today. I remember as a kid, like if you wanted to call even across the country to your family, it would cost a small fortune to be able to call, just say from San Diego to New York, let's say, on the telephone. Now you can do it on the internet for basically nothing, right? Or you could make it on your phone. If you've got a cell plan, you can call it for almost nothing. And even across the world, if you were going to call Europe, it would cost you like hundreds of dollars sometimes to call if you were going to have family in Europe from the United States. Now you can do it on the internet for free. And so the ability to provide information, get feedback has never been such as it is today. Um, and so with that means that our ability to relate to one another and interact with one another is also such as it is. And we have transportation that has been vast and has gotten faster and more avenues. Students, for example, are traveling more than they ever have. When I was in college, it's rare that students got to go overseas and really experience like study abroad programs like they have today at most four-year universities. And so now most college students at four-year schools have had some variation of experience of traveling to some place in the world other than the United States, uh, or at least a good percentage of them. So that really means that their view of the world has broadened based on their experiences. Um, but in that, the way that, when you look at the things that have happened in the world, for example, so you look at the things that we're confronting today, like climate change, right? Um, which is one of the big ticket issues that we confront. But also, looking at political systems, what's happening to democracies in the 21st century, where we see this rise of authoritarianism. What does that really mean? When you see first of all, why are democratic systems starting to look like they're failing, and what's leading to the rise of these authoritarian or autocratic regimes, um, and why are they happening, and what is the catalyst that's leading to them? Is it a failure of the legislative systems that aren't holding the leaders accountable? Are the people not understanding what the consequences of losing their democratic systems are? So there's a lot of things that play into it that help decide or help us lead us into a direction of trying to analyze and critique the countries that we have to interact with. The United States is arguably one of the largest powers on the planet, along with China and Russia and a few other peripheral players, but mainly China and Russia are the two big actors that challenge our rule and authority. But in that, we also have different philosophies, politically, socially, culturally, and how we go about interacting with each other and relating with one another is also inherently important. Um, so what happens is, and one of the big themes of this chapter really covers basically just sort of giving you an understanding why it's important, but also the way in which we look at the issue of why it's important. And we call this the levels of analysis. And simply stated, the levels of analysis are basically how we go about looking at, or which lens we go about looking at, uh, either critiquing the countries themselves or the infrastructures within those countries and why they do what they do. Um, and why is that important to the United States? Well, it's important for a lot of reasons. One, because usually we're doing business with most of those countries, and the idea of knowing what their strengths and weaknesses are is incredibly important. So if somebody were to ask you, if we were doing a study of looking at, let's say, Russia, for example, so what would it be important to know about Russia? What aspects of their infrastructure? Well, there's lots of things to be important. One is the political system, who runs the show. And yes, they have their version of Congress, which is called the Duma. How much authority does their Congress or Duma have? Or is Putin, even though he's a president and he's elected, is he really a dictator, or is he really a president that shares power? And if you look at the evidence, obviously he controls the system. But then there's also other things to note about Russia. The history of Russia, how, in terms of the evolution of its people, how they see the world around them is really important. Their military capabilities, their economic capabilities, uh, how they view certain issues like climate change, because we need them to step up and be a part of the equation in discussing or dealing with the issue. So there's all these nuances, right? So the levels of analysis allow us to critique it in more detailed ways. So, and sometimes when we have to look through all three lenses to be able to sort of ascertain how countries act, and how the leaders of those countries act. So, for example, uh, we start off with the individual level of analysis. And basically, what that means is that, okay, you have an individual or leader, and it's important to understand the sort of the psychology or operational mode of the leader. Like, what does Putin think? How does he operate? How does he do what he does? Where's his decision-making process come from? Does he have any pressure or constraints on him or her? So those kinds of things, when you look at the individual level, help us decide how we're going to deal with them, and where the buck stops, if you would, right? As Harry Truman used to famously say, the buck stops with him. But some leaders, the buck doesn't stop with them. And so the second level of analysis, which really deals with the domestic or state level of analysis, which really looks at the country itself. And then we look at, like, for example, the political system. Is it structured in such a way where they're constrained by a Congress of the United States, right? So the president can certainly take certain actions, but he can't do it without the sanctioning of Congress most of the time. And so the idea is we have these checks and balances in our system. And so understanding that, we've created this bureaucracy or infrastructure of how we are able to accomplish certain things and get things done. So this is really the key essential aspect. Excuse the background noise. I'm down here by the beach, enjoying the great weather and the breeze. So it's cute. Sorry about the little noise in the background, but it's all organic, and I love to do it this way. So um, and so that tells us, like, what kinds of constraints the leaders may have on them, or do they have a leadership structure where the legislative body makes the decisions? Is it a presidential system? Is it a parliamentary system? Is it an authoritarian system? What kind of system of government does that country operate under? So we can also decide how we deal with them. If they're a democratic system, are they not a non-democratic system? All those things really is how we evolve into and look at on the domestic level or state level of analysis. And then the next level of analysis is more systemic. It has to do with, like, in terms of in the global system, like, what are the pushes and pulls systemically on those countries, and this is much more of a wider, bigger picture of the philosophy of how that country fits within the global system, right? And so it's really important to understand all three levels and be able to look through all three lenses. So, for example, when I talk about the system level, I'll use an example going back to the Cold War period after World War II, where we have this East-West rivalry. We have basically capitalism on one side, which is a systemic thing, and you have communism on the other side, which is also a systemic thing. So you have this East-West rivalry, which we used to call it, which is really a byproduct of the battle of capitalism, which is considered supposedly good, even though it has its problems as well, and also communism, which also has some aspects that can be positive if you look at the deeper levels of communism, but also is problematic when the people who control it don't use it the way it was supposed to be used. So understanding the systemic aspects of those things really is important. Understanding the context, we're even looking at climate change, which is a systemic issue, has to do a lot to do with how certain countries view the use of materials. Like, are they using coal still, for example? Or are they looking at alternative sources for energy? And so those kinds of things really are more systemic in base, and we have to look at those things as well. Military capabilities also, even though it's a domestic thing in terms of what their capabilities are, it's a systemic concept in terms of military, in terms of who's controlling what parts of the country, the ideas of colonialism and who controls the resources of the planet. Those things are all part of that equation as well. And a lot of times when we're analyzing it, you might find that if I gave you a test and I said, here's an event. Let's take Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Russia, United States almost come to the brink of nuclear war. What saved us? Was it, if you were looking at the crises, and would you say that it was the individual level of analysis, meaning Kennedy and Khrushchev being who they were, or was it the domestic level? Was it basically how Russia and the United States, within their confines of their legislative bodies and judicial bodies, were constrained from doing certain things? Or was it a systemic issue that helped solve the problem? When you look at capitalism in the West and communism in the East, what saved us from blowing each other up? And sometimes when you're analyzing things, you may find that it might have been a little bit of both, depending on what stage of the crises that you're in. The missile crisis lasted 13 days in October 1962. But at any point in time in there, you might assess, well, at the beginning it was this, at the end it was really individual level, because Kennedy and Khrushchev, if they hadn't been there and been who they were, it might have gone a whole different way, right? So the importance of this and the importance of understanding the context of why we study this is because why we study international relations, because the world is getting smaller and smaller. And so even though we have this vast world, the resources are limited. How we share those resources, how we treat one another as respecting each other's countries and differences, and historical differences and ideological differences, religious differences, economic differences, all those different aspects help us be better, or do a better job of understanding other countries. And as the world is getting smaller, that becomes much more important. So you'll see as we go forward through the book, you'll see more of the examples of this, and we'll see them play out throughout the textbook. So get ready for the ride, and I will see you in chapter 2.